Thank you all for coming today. We are a group of WPI student researchers, and we've been spending our past about 2 months in the city of Venice assessing the condition and availability of the urban green space, in particular in Cannaregio, Venice. We have been working alongside, obviously, the Venice Project Center and the nonprofit group We Are Here Venice, of which our sponsor is here with us today. We Are Here Venice is a nonprofit group that works, among other things, on promoting Venice as a living city and looking at stewardship efforts for looking at these urban green spaces to try and better look after and maintain these very important spaces to our city. I'm Will Babinsack.
I'm Peter Fernholz.
I'm Olivia Garrity.
I'm Justin Winoski. So what is an urban green space? Well, urban green spaces are natural areas, typically like parks, courtyards, private gardens, and decorative street spaces. And to explain what decorative street spaces are, they're typically just small green space areas surrounded by pavement consisting of grass or trees, usually used for decor. And what is the benefit of these spaces? Well, they produce an area for relaxation, recreation activities, and numerous amount of environmental benefits such as reducing the urban heat and carbon reduction, as well as many more environmental impacts. And so far, WPI has inventoried 472 total spaces, starting off in 2017 in Giudecca and last year in Castello. But as you can see, there's a lot of empty space there still. So that brings us to our project, which is to continue the inventorying of green spaces in Cannaregio, Venice, and to help the maintenance, use, and stewardships of the green spaces.
So to achieve this goal, we first pre-mapped 489 green spaces using satellite images, specifically Google My Maps. And we surveyed all of the green spaces that we could access. So we did a systematic direct observation to collect all of our data. We started in the west side of Cannaregio and worked island by island all the way to the east side. And so we found different types of green spaces in terms of their public availability. So for example, some areas are open to the public 24/7. For example, this green space that's located by the train station is open to the public at all times because it doesn't have any gates or anything to close it off. Some areas are available at certain times, so they're mainly limited in their hours of operation. So for example, Parco Savrignon is closed after a certain time, and so the gates are closed to the public. And then we have some areas that need special permission or a ticket for entry. For example, this garden that's associated with the Jewish Museum of Venice is you need a ticket to get into. And finally, there are many spaces that are closed to the public. For example, this one large green space is completely walled off and appears to be under construction, so none of the public can get into it. And we found that 419 out of 489 green spaces are completely closed to the public. Many of these spaces are likely small gardens or private backyards for individuals to use, but nothing available for the public. 23 green spaces are conditionally available, meaning you need a ticket or special permission to enter. And finally, 47 green spaces are mostly or fully available, meaning that they would only be limited by their hours of operation.
And to show all the available green spaces, we highlighted all the best green spaces in Cannaregio, Venice in our booklet here. So contained within that, we took note of things like availability, which consists of the address and the time of operation of these green spaces. We also took note of stuff like handicap accessibility, which is determined by the type of pathways there. So for example, heavy gravel might be really bad for wheelchairs and crutches. So we just took note of what type there was, like if it was paved, light gravel, or made out of dirt, just to help those residents that are in need. We also took note of any vegetation that was there, more specifically plant photos for those that want to enjoy the aroma of flowers when they go to green spaces, tree photos for those that want to stay in the shade and get away from the sun, land condition, specifically the grass of each green space to see if it's barren or dry, just for those that want to have some recreational activity, as well as amenities. We took note of stuff like playgrounds for kids to exert energy and have fun, benches for those that want to sit down, enjoy the scenery, and relax at these spaces, as well as light posts for those that want to go kind of in the afternoon when it starts getting dark. We also took note of any other additional amenities, such as like trash cans, ashtrays, and water fountains for those that it will apply to. And all of this information can be seen on our catalog, which is available through the catalog tab on our website or via the QR code.
And so also on our website, you can find interactive maps of all of the green spaces that we inventoried. So for example, you can click on any of the area photos. This is a picture of Parco Sauvignon. The image expands and you can see other details from Google Maps, since this is done through Google My Maps. And you can click on the image again to further enlarge it. You can also click on any of the green polygons. These are sorted by availability. And so, for example, in Parco Sauvignon, there are gravel walkways, we have direct canal access, 35 benches, and 20 light posts.
So out of the spaces we were able to access, we wanted to look into the condition that these green spaces were in. And the 5 different types of maintenance needs that we wanted to look into were litter, so if there's any trash that was left in a public area. We wanted to look at undergrowth, which is the undergrowing of vegetation in the area. We wanted to look at overgrowth, which is an excess of vegetation. We want to look into any broken amenities that were in these green spaces, such as benches, fences, or water fountains that may not be working. And we want to look at cosmetic needs, so any other aspect of the green space, but that doesn't really impact the functionality of the green space. So looking into these maintenance needs, out of the 66 in total that we were able to get access to, we documented that there were 55 different types, 55 different spaces that had maintenance issues, some of them having multiple maintenance needs within them. So 12 of these green spaces needed cosmetic improvements, and as you see as a picture on the left, we have a visual map of all of the areas in red that were in need of these cosmetic improvements. Some of these being that if there was not enough mulch to cover an area, but we wanted to look less into these types of maintenance needs due to the fact that it is wintertime and maintenance issues such as these wouldn't be as in cycle as other needs. And we also looked into, we saw that 30 spaces needed better landscaping. We combined both undergrowth and overgrowth in this category due to the fact that it is winter again and this is more of a spring and summertime upkeep. So on the top we can see that in this northwestern area there were bunch of barren areas, so that was something to note into the spring or the summertime. Out of the 19 spaces that we saw that had an excessive litter, we really wanted to look into litter because this is an all-around maintenance need. So mostly we were seeing a lot of the maintenance needs for litter on the west side of the Cannaregio area. And going into further with litter, we noted that there were 12 spaces that had litter issues with no trash cans. We thought that this was an issue due to the fact that if there were trash cans in these areas, then maybe these litter problems wouldn't be an issue. We also documented that 4 spaces had predominant cigarette litter, and this could mean that, as the visual on the right, there were a lot of cigarette butts piled up in a specific area in the green space, and we noted these spaces because we also saw that there was no ashtrays in these areas. So we also saw that 15 spaces have amenities that need repairs. Some of these spaces could have multiple amenities, but in total there were 15. And mostly we saw that there were a lot of benches that needed fixing, and we also noticed that there were a lot of fences that needed fixing. So there is a public complaint system for the City of Venice called DME, where you can submit any sort of report that the city has. We then reported any of the broken amenities that we saw, as well as we suggested the ashtrays to those 4 predominant places.
So we also wanted to look at whether or not there's enough green space in Cannaregio for the population. The World Health Organization recommends 9 square meters of urban green space per individual. And so there seems to be enough green space in Cannaregio because we have about 180,000 square meters of green space for a population of about 14,000. So this would give us about 13 square meters of green space per individual. But we want to know whether there's enough available green space in Cannaregio, which there's not. So there's about 32,000 square meters of publicly available green space, and with the population of 14,000, this gives us about 2 square meters of green space per individual. And this deficit gets even worse when considering tourists. So to estimate the tourist population, we simply multiplied the resident population by 2, And so this gives us about 1 square meter of green space per individual for both residents and tourists.
So we know that there's not that much available green space in the city area of Cannaregio. So the question becomes, how usable is that available space? Well, let's define usability. If we look to the World Health Organization, they recommend about 5,000 square meter minimum for the size of a green space for it to be actually useful. The problem with that metric is that in the entire Sicieri, there are only 5 spaces total that meet or exceed that number, and that's including spaces that are more limited and difficult to access, or ones that are completely closed off. Parco Chavagnan is the only somewhat accessible area that beats that criteria. So for us to access is something usable in Cannaregio specifically, we need to come up with a bit of a better definition for usability. So we looked at relaxing that 5,000 square meters and giving a 1,000 square meter requirement for something that's still useful, but a bit more within the scope of something that's realistic in the city of Venice, as well as looking at if these spaces have useful amenities. So where are the amenities throughout the city? If a green space fits either of these criterion, we're going to call it useful. Looking at these two constraints, we found about 11 areas of greenery throughout the city that could actually provide some use for people to go to and use. But we can go even deeper into figuring out how well these serve the population, because another part of the World Health Organization's recommendation is that green space should be within a 3-minute travel time of where somebody lives or works. So all of these polygons throughout this map show a 3-minute walking distance from each of these green areas, and we can see pretty clearly that the eastern side of Cannaregio is pretty much devoid of accessible, useful green space. So what can we do about this? Well, we, looking through our data set, have identified some spaces that, if efforts are made to make them more available, could help improve this distribution throughout the city. And we can see that, looking at those 3-minute maps again, we would add and cover basically the rest of the Sicieri with these spaces. Did I break this? Perfect. So how did we pick some of these spaces? So we mainly looked into the spaces that are conditionally available, spaces that some people can get into, but really for most of the public, it's pretty difficult. Of course, we looked mostly at the ones on the east side of Cannaregio, and we really care about the ones that are larger. And we think that efforts to open these spaces, even if just for certain hours, certain days or seasons, to help make something more available to the people throughout the city, would go a long way in improving the distribution of green space throughout the city. So we're going to step through a few examples of what some of these spaces look like and some of the challenges that we might run into in opening them up. Some of them are schools. So for example, highlighted here are 2 schools that are in the Cannaregio area, the Foscarini School, which has a green space of about 1,200 square meters, and the Antonio Dieto School, which has a green space of an area of about 3,000 square meters. So there's obvious reasons why these wouldn't be available to the public during school hours, but even if on the weekends or non-school hours or when school's out of session, making these green spaces obviously more available to the people that live in the area, especially people that would have trouble walking or crossing over a bunch of bridges to get to the other side, would go a long way. There are also a lot of green space wrapped up in hotels. The area taken by hotels adds up to at least 8,500 square meters. 2 of the largest ones in the city are the Palazzo dei Dogi and the Casa Cardinal Piazza at 3,000 and 3,300 square meters, respectively. And we can see by the photos that these are pretty nice spaces that would be good for the people on the eastern side to be able to go to. So now, there are obviously private interests that would conflict with making these a bit more accessible to the public, but there's also the public need to have some more green space. So we have to try and balance those needs. So finding ways to make these more accessible in any way, whether it be limited hours or other types of permissions, would involve discussion with the city and with the hotels, but we do think it would be an effort that would be worth looking into. There's also some spaces that we still don't know that much about, but we think would be useful to look into. For example, there's this space located near the old school of Santa Maria that is pretty large and in a good location, but we were unable to access it by going there and are still unable to identify exactly its ownership status. So looking further into opening spaces like this would also be very beneficial.
So with these recommendations, we are going to provide those to our sponsor, We Are Here Venice, in hopes of obtaining stewardship organizations that could help open up these spaces, as well as maintain and upkeep these spaces. So in summary, we have created a publicly accessible data set of these green spaces, and specifically for Cannaregio Venice. We have reported all the maintenance recommendations to the city, and we have identified potential spaces for improving green space availability to the public. So in total, there are now 961 spaces cataloged in Venice, in specifically the Cannaregio, Castello, and Giudecca area, and we hope that future WPI students will help fill in the remaining gap. Thank you, and are there any questions?